"You're fired." Amy Walker wiped down the counter yet again. Her third time in the last 10 minutes. Her gaze kept darting toward the clock hanging above the kitchen window. Almost closing time. Another long, quiet night at Joe's Diner, a small roadside restaurant where she had been working for the past 2 years. The place wasn't busy tonight. Not even close. Fewer customers meant fewer tips. And that was a problem she couldn't afford right now. Bills were piling up, and rent was due next week. She had barely scraped together enough to cover it, and the slow shifts weren't helping. Just then, the soft chime of the bell above the entrance made her look up. A man stood hesitantly in the doorway, a tall, thin figure with worn-out clothes, scuffed-up boots and messy hair. Everything about him spoke of exhaustion, like someone carrying a weight too heavy for one person to bear. But despite his weary stance, he held himself with quiet dignity, as if life had knocked him down more times than he could count, yet he still refused to break. He took a cautious step forward, his fingers pulling a few crumpled bills from his pocket. When he reached the counter, he cleared his throat before speaking. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice rough but respectful. "What can I get for $5? Amy glanced up at the menu board, knowing full well that the cheapest meal cost at least $8. $5 wouldn't get him much, maybe a small side dish and a cup of coffee at best. But when she looked into his tired eyes, her decision was made before she even thought twice. "You're in luck," she said with a warm smile. "Tonight we've got a special, one full meal for just $5. His brows lifted slightly, as if kindness was something unfamiliar to him. "Really? Really?" Amy confirmed, already ringing up the order before he could argue. Minutes later, she placed a steaming plate of food in front of him. He stared at it for a moment, then looked back at her. "You didn't have to do this," he murmured. Amy shrugged, offering a small smile. "Everyone deserves a warm meal." For the first time, the corners of his lips twitched upward. He picked up his fork, ready to take the first bite. But before he could, a sharp voice sliced through the air. "Amy!" The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She turned to see Rick, the diner's manager, storming toward her. His expression twisted with irritation. "What do you think you're doing?" he snapped, eyes narrowing at the plate of food. Amy's stomach tightened. She straightened her shoulders and met his glare. "I paid for it myself," she said, keeping her voice steady. Rick scoffed. "We're not running a charity. If you want to feed bums, do it somewhere else." Amy's hands clenched into fists. "He's a veteran." Rick rolled his eyes. "Not my problem." Then, to everyone's shock, he grabbed the plate right off the counter and tossed it into the trash. The diner went silent. Amy's breath caught as she watched the food slide into the garbage like it was worthless. The veteran didn't move. He sat still, hands resting in his lap, his face unreadable. Rick dusted off his hands like he had just gotten rid of something filthy. "Now get back to work." Amy's blood boiled. "You're a disgrace," she said through gritted teeth. Rick smirked. "And you're unemployed." For a second she thought she had misheard him. But the smug look on his face told her she hadn't. "You're firing me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rick crossed his arms, smirk widening. "That's right. Grab your things and get out." Amy scanned the room, searching for someone, anyone, to speak up. But her co-workers kept their heads down, too scared to get involved. The few customers inside sat frozen, whispering among themselves but staying silent. The veteran slowly rose to his feet, locking eyes with Rick. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Rick snorted. "I don't owe you anything, old man." The veteran didn't flinch. He simply nodded, then turned back to Amy. "Thank you for your kindness," he said softly. Amy forced a small smile, even though her stomach twisted with uncertainty. "I wish I could have done more." "You already did more than most," he replied. Then, with one last glance at her, he walked toward the door. Amy turned back to Rick, her jaw tight. "You're going to regret this." Rick let out a dry laugh. Doubt it. Amy grabbed her coat and stepped outside, the cold air stinging her skin. Her mind spun with uncertainty. No job. No backup plan. No idea what to do next. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that within 24 hours everything would change. Amy barely slept that night. The weight of what had happened pressed heavily on her chest. She had lost her job not because she had done something wrong but because she had done something right. It wasn't fair. It would never be fair. By morning, she had no choice but to go job hunting. She pulled on her warmest coat and stepped outside, her breath visible in the cold air. She spent hours going from business to business, filling out applications, but each conversation ended the same way. We're not hiring right now. By noon, she found herself near Joe's diner again. She didn't have a reason to be there, but something kept her lingering across the street. The place looked the same, as if nothing had happened. Then, a deep rumbling noise filled the air. She turned toward the sound. A military convoy, jeeps and armored vehicles, rolled down the main road. People stopped in their tracks, staring as the line of vehicles slowed. Then stopped right in front of Joe's diner. Inside, Rick had been going about his day like normal. He had no regrets about firing Amy. Employees were replaceable. But when the bell above the door jingled, he looked up, expecting another customer. Instead, a tall man in a decorated military uniform stepped inside, flanked by a dozen Marines. Their combat boots struck the floor in perfect unison. The entire diner fell into stunned silence. Rick blinked. "Can I help you?" The officer's sharp eyes scanned the room. "We're looking for Amy Walker." Silence. Rick hesitated. She doesn't work here anymore." The officer's expression didn't change. "We know." Before Rick could respond, the door opened again. Frank stepped inside. But he wasn't the same man from the night before. Today, he wore a full Marine dress uniform, ribbons and medals neatly displayed. Rick's jaw tightened. "Frank." Frank didn't even look at him. Instead, he turned to the officer. "This is Colonel James Carter," he said. "And these men. They're my brothers." Rick swallowed hard. I don't understand." Frank let out a slow breath. "Yesterday, a young woman showed me kindness when no one else would. And for that, she lost her job." Colonel Carter took a step forward. "Frank Mitchell isn't just any veteran. He's a decorated war hero. And the way he was treated here is unacceptable." Rick's hands clenched. Listen, I didn't know." "You didn't care," Frank interrupted. Then, Colonel Carter turned toward the window and locked eyes with Amy, who was still standing outside. "Amy Walker," he called out. Every head turned to her. Amy hesitated. But something in the colonel's voice, steady, firm but not unkind, made her feet move.